This place has welcomed travelers for generations, where journeys of hope began, where survivors found sanctuary, live stories of courage in the darkest times, of ordinary people choosing to be extraordinary. This is Hear My Story.
I'm Corey Silbernagel, Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. Today we're joined by someone who has spent much of his life learning his family's history and interpreting history for others in ways that matter. Dan Hurley, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, it's great being here. I love this institution.
You have just finished a book.
Right.
You have spent much of your career studying our local history, sharing that with others. But this is a very different project for you because this is a personal project, a project about your family.
Right.
So let's dive in and talk a little bit about that. How did you get started?
Well, I knew that my father had written my mother during World War II and that she had saved the letters. That was a very basic understanding. I had no idea. When I started this project, I thought, well, maybe there's going to be 200 letters. Turns out there's over 720 letters. And my father never talked about his experience in World War II. The little bit I knew about what he might have encountered came from my mother, who was much more loquacious and spoke about a lot of things. But she would say some things. And so, for example, when the Holocaust and Humanities Center was getting started at Hebrew Union College, I was doing some consulting work with them, and just in a friendly sort of way. And I mentioned it to my mother, and she said, "Oh, your father was at Dachau. Did you know that?" And I, "No, I didn't know that." My father died in 1977, so this is long after he had died. And she said, "Oh, yeah, he wrote this very powerful letter." And so I got a copy and gave it to the center. And the center has used it over the years. It's even represented in the exhibit.
It is, yeah.
And so I knew that, but I didn't know anything else. So after I retired in theory in 2016. I turned 70. I decided I was going to retire from Leadership Cincinnati. And then I failed retirement almost immediately and went to the Freedom Center as their president for a little over a year. Then I failed again and went to WVXU for a year. And at that point I said, well, should get into these letters, which my mother had saved. She died in 2013 at 94. And I thought, I owe it to my family, to my two sisters, my brother, all of our grandchildren, to sort of pull this together, find out what's there, and tell the story. Now, I thought of this as something I would create a manuscript from, book-like, but not a book. Got into it and discovered, wait a minute. And my assumption was that these were very personal letters and, not about big things and what could possibly be there, and it wouldn't be something that people broadly would be interested in. But then I get into these letters and I find out there are major issues that are reflected in these letters. My father's relationship with the segregated army of World War II, my father's units ending up as liberators at Dachau. And it turns out that my father was very observant, an excellent writer, and could really sort of capture things. Many times things he didn't understand what he was capturing, but in the light of 80 years, we can look back and say, oh, this is related to this larger theme. So I got into the middle of this project and said, wait a minute, this isn't just for the 30 people in a couple of generations. This is something a wider audience could be interested in. And then it started emerging as a book. The original title of this book was Dearest Margie, because my mother's name was Margie, and that's how he started most of his letters, either Dear Margie or Dearest Margie. And so it was really stressing that personal side. And then it went through many different phases. And of course, how do you take 720 letters and not bore people to death? How do you find the story that sort of connects all of these together and yet still let his voice come through? We don't have my mother's letters to my father. He's not carrying them around Europe. He's not saving them. But you hear her voice too, because she's writing to him, asking questions, making reflections about what's happening at home, and he's writing back and saying, well, you said such and such in this letter, here's my response to that. So you can hear her voice as well. So I wanted to preserve the fact that these were the voices of this young couple living through World War II, and yet get to that larger framework of how the war transformed them, but most importantly, transformed my father.
That's really fascinating. I think letter collections are so special because, as you said, you often only have one side of that correspondence. Right. But it's through that one side that you glean insight on who was writing to them. Right. So it really is a beautiful collection of letters. I've been very privileged to read some of them over the years. Right. But I can only imagine what it was like for you to begin this project that was very personal, yeah. And was meant not for a large audience, but you, being a historian, being a public historian, read these letters and some of the other items that you were working with, the scrapbooks and
right.
other pieces, and you knew that there was bigger context and important themes that were being addressed. I think, one of the most powerful ways that we can share history is to personalize and localize that history. So, exactly what you have done is what we hold so dear to storytelling here at the Holocaust Center.
Well, and it's interesting. As a professional historian, you sort of are trained to keep the subject matter at arm's length. I don't believe in the word objectivity. I think that's a silly word, but it's you're trying to respect the materials, but you're not trying to impose yourself on them. But here I am reading these letters, and the fact that my parents, young newly married couple, is talking about starting a family, no surprise there. But pretty quickly they start talking about this new family they're going to create by talking about the first child, who they have named in the letters Danny. And that totally threw me off. The day that I found it for the first time, I remember telling my wife, I can't believe this. I'm being talked about. And then my parents go on to talk about what this child is going to be like and how they're going to raise him. And it's like, it throws you off. Doing this kind of family history, but trying to make it about ongoing significant issues. But there are these very personal things that sort of change your way of approaching the subject matter that I haven't ever had in any other studies that I've done.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Before we go too much deeper into your mom and dad's relationship, but also your dad's experiences at
Right.
Dachau and in the Army more generally, let's back up a little bit. Tell me who your parents were. Where were they from, and what brought Irwin, your dad, to the military?
Well, both my mother and my father grew up in northern Kentucky, so right across the Ohio River from here, from Cincinnati. And they were both born in the city of Covington, and they both, in their teens, my father was 4 years older than my mother, they both moved to the hilltop suburb right outside of Covington called Park Hills. Mm-hmm. My father moves there when he's 13. His parents moved there. My grandfather was the second mayor of Park Hills. So they both start out as urban kids, but then they become suburban. My father what sort of sets him apart is that he's not the sort of World War II soldier who was drafted when they were 18 or volunteered when they were 17 and pretended they were 18. He was 27 years old when he was drafted. He had already not only completed high school, which wasn't mandatory at the time, he had completed college. He went to Xavier University. He had also gotten a law degree from what was called the YMCA Law School in YMCA, the Central YMCA downtown on Central Parkway. It's now known as the Chase College of Law, headquartered over at NKU, but that's not. And it was designed for people who are already in work. He graduated from college, became the head of a savings and loan, which were very common in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky. His father was on the board of the savings and loan. He kept that job his entire life until he died.
That. Wow.
My father and my mother, she was 4 years younger. She graduated from high school but never went to college. They found each other on the tennis courts in Dachau Park and fell in love, got married in July of 1941. And they bought their first house on Rose Circle in Park Hills, right across the street for all practical purposes from his parents. And he lived in that house the rest of his life. My mother lived there until she was 86 before.
It's beautiful.
So so many things were set before he was drafted in 1942. And that really sets him off. He's better educated. He writes very well. He is older. He's married. He's settled. He's got a job. He thought he understood his path in life, and then along comes the war. He is not looking for adventure. He is not looking at the beginning for how he can be involved in battles. He hates the fact that he's been drafted. It's disrupting his life. And he is not a happy camper for the first 14 months in the military. He doesn't have a lot of respect for what he sees there. They're writing constantly, and a constant theme is this war is going to be over soon. They constantly believe that somehow the war is going to end soon if the Russians can just overwhelm the Germans or what, they have all kinds of theories. But the goal was to get home. So he has a little bit different background. So somebody had said to me the other day, they had read the book, and they said, well, I'd sort of forgotten what it was like to be a young person. This was a person who's about my age. And they said, I'd forgotten what it was like to be a young person. I said, well, that's interesting you say that, because I don't think of my parents, and especially my father, as a young person, because he had already completed formal education. He was already in his job. And my father-in-law, who was also in World War II and landed at D-Day, on D-Day at Omaha Beach, he was almost 10 years older than my father. So he was at the top of the age group that you could even be in the service. So my father was somewhere in between. He had started his life, and the war comes along and disrupts it, and he has to find how to become a soldier. That's part of the story here.
That's interesting. And he also, he shares so much deep perspective in the letters. No. It's helpful to have that context. I hadn't really thought about that before. He had lived life and had experiences that helped him understand.
Besides the letters, there's 2 diaries. But there's a third diary, a diary he started keeping that my mother saved, a diary he started keeping when he was 13 years old, when he moves to Park Hills. But more importantly is when he started to play the trumpet. That was the key. Music was really important to him growing up. And he talks about being in bands and playing all around town. And this diary is filled with interesting stuff. He keeps it until he goes to college, until he's into college. And I really think of that process of keeping that diary from the time he's 13 until the time he's 19 or so is when he taught himself to be observant, to write things down and to comment on what they mean, and to save things. He tucked things in the diary. That there were letters tucked into the diary that were very revealing, that end up giving a little twist at a couple points in the early first chapter of the book. So yeah, that being observant, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think he also shares a lot of has much foresight in commenting and sharing perspective of those in Germany and in Europe, those he encounters, what life has been like for them, also at war, as a country at war.
Yeah, there's two things about that. One, yes, he has an opinion about everything. He's a very opinionated person. I can vouch for that as his son. He was very opinionated. He was not shy in expressing it. So he basically spent 3 days in England. Most of that was going across the country in a train so he could get from the port to another port where he was transshipped to France. But he made all sorts of judgments about the British in 3 days, spending most of the time on a train. But certainly in France and in Germany, he was able to make had insights about the culture in France, Germany, other places he encountered. The other thing, though, is this exercise of writing this book was a great reminder that as a professional historian, I've always tried to teach my students when I've been in the classroom, is to remind people that the people at the time, whatever they were involved in, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't know the Allies were going to win World War II. They didn't know when the war was going to end. They didn't know, and as a lieutenant, he didn't know what the military strategy was. He just did what he was told to do. And there were all sorts of things in these letters that he makes observations that I found intriguing, but only when I was able to put those in a larger context. Just to give you an example, after the fighting in Europe was over, he was part of a truck company. He was an officer with a truck company. So they were transporting people, displaced persons, DPs, on their way back home, wherever home was, whether it was Poland, whether it was the Soviet Union, whether it was Estonia. And they were taking them on the first leg out of Munich to someplace. And in that, he makes the comments a number of times that some of the people they were transporting didn't want to go home. And I thought, boy, that's really intriguing. I didn't know what to make of it. And then I found David Nassau's book, The Last Million, which is just an incredible piece of historical research. And he puts into context why certain people wouldn't want to go home. Obviously, people who were left in some of the camps who were Jewish or were survivors, they didn't want to go home because there was no home to go to. They weren't going to be welcomed back anyway. But there were others from the Soviet Union or from the Baltic states who had joined the German army. They weren't going to be welcomed back home because they would have been seen as traitors from wherever home was. So Nassau, and that happens again and again, it reminds me that my father, as insightful as he was, could only see so much at that moment in 1944, 45. And his letters hint at it, but he didn't understand the full implications of it.
That is a perfect point to make. I think often about perspective in hindsight or in the moment. I think your dad had incredible foresight to document those observances, but you're entirely right. What what could he know beyond the scope of his world in that moment? So, as we as professionals look back in history, I think that's really important to always keep in mind. And it's something we have to keep in mind with a lot of our work at the Holocaust and Humanities Center. History is complex.
And it reveals itself, and in the process, it reveals things about the people who were involved that they didn't fully understand at the time. That's why it's crossing borders, international borders, but the biggest border he crossed was between the greater Cincinnati area, northern Kentucky, which was the upper South, into the deep South.
Yeah.
And he had experienced that, but crossing borders into Germany, into France, but also expanding boundaries. Every time you cross a border that you weren't expecting to, we all grow up in bubbles. Either our bubble gets punctured from the outside or we break through the bubble and become different people. And this experience of being in the Army made him more than just the middle class, better educated than normal, Catholic young man that he would have been if the war had never happened. He had just lived his life in northern Kentucky. He met all kinds of people he would never have met in any other situation.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about what his experience was in the Army in the U.S. among his unit.
Well, he went to basic. He went to clerical school, and then he gets sent to officers candidate school. Now, the irony is that when he's in basic and clerical school, especially in basic, he had no use for the officers he ran into. He makes the comment, "I can't see these people following anybody. I wouldn't want to follow this guy into battle," type of thing. So, but then he gets sent to officers candidate school because he's probably more educated, and I find that chapter really interesting. It was really difficult to be in OCS. And he comes out as an officer in the quartermaster corps, which seemingly he has no understanding really of quartermaster, because after his formal training and being commissioned as an officer, he spent a month in additional training in Columbus and a month in Louisville, which are both close to Covington, so he could get home, and he and my mom sort of reestablished a normal marital relationship. And then right after New Year's of 1944, he gets the orders that he's being transferred to this unit, this truck company, out at a camp outside of Durham, North Carolina, so now the deeper South. And he gets there, and the first thing he notices is, and he writes to my mother, this company is made up of 105 officers and 130 African-American enlisted men. This is a colored troop. I had no idea. He didn't know it until he got to the camp. Now, 80% plus of all African Americans who served in World War II served in the quartermaster. They weren't allowed to serve in the frontline units because they weren't seen as capable of doing that because of the segregation and the racial attitudes that characterized the United States at the time. But he is shocked by this, and he finds himself in this unit, which, by the way, there's 5 white officers. The captain is Jewish and speaks fluent German. One of the other lieutenants is Jewish. So there's 2 Jewish officers and then 3 other officers, 3 other white officers, and then these 130 plus, and the number fluctuates over the months, of enlisted men from the Deep South. And he's assigned as personnel director, or personnel officer. So he's got all the background on these people. And one of the things he finds out very quickly is that the typical enlistee has a 5th grade education. And 40% of those 130 enlisted men had active venereal cases. VD cases. He is shocked by this. And what he finds out is that the Army, up until 6 months before, if you were drafted and you had VD, you were out. You didn't get in the Army. But they needed bodies. So they put people in the Army and they treated them because it was perfectly treatable. Many of the men didn't know they had an illness and didn't have any idea that it could be treated. So then he sees the total minimal educational background of these men. And he, as somebody who's a college graduate and a professional graduate, he's shocked by this. And his way of translating it is this is what America has done to these people. He has this very important paragraph in one of his letters where he says, these men are just like us. He's writing to my mother. They're just like us. They think like us, except they're not educated, and they therefore come to different conclusions. Now, he thinks education is the answer to everything. I'm middle-class educated kid. So, but the point here is he, could have been assigned to this kind of company and reacted as, oh my gosh, I want nothing to do with this. He could have adopted, I'm sure he went into the situation with your typical racist views. Not that my father ever, as an adult, my household, that was not acceptable. I never heard my parents say, but he was not an agitator for equality either. So but he could have reacted in a number of ways, but his way of reacting was, for the first time since I've joined the Army, I have found purpose in helping pull these men into a working unit, into a company that can be a good trucking unit. I can help them. He was assigned to do, all the men had to finish their basic training by taking some written test to prove that they were basically literate. He was responsible for that. He took pride in that. So his reaction to that I find very intriguing, because it could have been just the opposite. He also, by the way, had no experience before that of ever interacting with Jews. So, and Sherman Horowitz, who was the captain, becomes his best friend in the Army, and they do maintain relationships, which I did not realize. I learned that only from my youngest sister, who my family visited the Horowitzes in New England on a vacation, but that was long after I was married and out of the house. I had no idea that relationship existed, even as I started to read the letters. It's just intriguing how this person, why did he respond in this positive way when somebody else could have responded in a very negative and racist way? It's just intriguing to me.
Yeah, I think it's really special and maybe not ordinary that he reacts in empathy.
Yeah.
And an understanding of the people around him. You mentioned that he felt he'd found purpose and mission in the Army. Did he build a strong team? And what happened to them when they went to Europe?
Well, it's interesting that, I mentioned that for the first 14, 16 months, he was not a happy camper in the Army. Didn't have much use for this man's U.S. Army. He didn't. And by the end of fighting in Europe, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to go, he assumes they're going to be sent to the Pacific. By that time, he says, we're a great unit. We should be sent to the Pacific. We could really help out. He has real pride. There has been some sort of esprit de corps created in this company that he recognizes, he takes pride in, and he believes they can make a contribution. So he was assuming that they were going to be shipped from Europe to the Pacific. His only hope was that they would get a month off and he could go home and see Margie for a month. Now, the atomic bomb and the end of the war in Japan changes all of that. But by that time, he really believes. And their first really intense combat was the clearing of the Colmar Pocket in January of 1945. That's where they ended up at that point. That was the last piece of territory that the Nazis controlled west of the Rhine, and Eisenhower wanted that cleared before they really went into Germany and attacked full strength. And they were very involved in that, and he writes about the pride with which how well the unit operated. And you mentioned there was a scrapbook that my mother kept the letter that he received from, I don't know, some general ahead of them saying his unit had performed incredibly well and, said all kinds of nice things. Obviously, he cared a lot about that. They saved it. And so, yes, that was transformed. Here's what I didn't get. I don't really know. I can't tell exactly what the personal relationships were between he and the enlisted men, the African American enlisted men. He talks about that to some extent. I don't know names because the Army did not retain unit lists in the National Archives. They don't exist for World War II. So I couldn't get the names and what state they were from. So I could have gone and done census analysis. I didn't have that, and I really regret. That's the biggest regret I have. So, for example, where for the African Americans, there was a real debate when war broke out. Do they respond and fight for the United States, a country that treated them very poorly? And there was an argument that went on inside the African American community, and sort of what comes out is the theory of the double V campaign. Victory in Europe, but victory in the United States. Victory over Hitler, but then we're going to come home and victory over Jim Crow and segregation. Now, how much that spirit of fighting for the double V it was part of the men in his company, and did he talk to them about that? Did he have that kind of relationship? He never mentions that, so I don't know. I know very few. I know a few first names. I know the name of his driver, drove his Jeep, or at least his first driver, because Willie tried to pass a truck and had to stop suddenly, and my father was dozing and got thrown into the windshield. So Willie lost his job the next day.
Oh no!
So I know Willie's name, but I don't know what those relationships were. But as a unit, they end up in the end once the Colmar pocket is cleared, they get assigned to support the 12th Armored Division, which is under Patton. And that's where they spend the rest of the war. And clearly, they are very good at that. They're very good at keeping supplied. And if you know anything about the truck companies, what they were carrying food, they were carrying medicine, but they were really carrying gasoline to keep the mechanized army moving. And they didn't have great big tanker trucks like we have today to carry gas. They were carrying gas in 5 and 10 gallon cans. And so it's a very different sort of thing. And that's what they were doing. And he talks a lot about that.
Interesting. One thing that stood out to me in this book, but also, over the years of sharing Irwin's story within our museum, he is a liberator of Dachau.
Yes.
But he doesn't write much of this or talk much of it. So can you first tell me what happened, and then I want to talk a little bit about why he didn't share, or what you knew, how you came to know.
At the end of the fighting in Europe, Patton's army had driven south into Bavaria, so they basically end up in Munich at the end of fighting. Dachau is 11 miles outside the center of Munich. And he went into Dachau multiple times. How many, I'm not sure. He writes about 2 separate times. And there are photographs from 2 separate times. The first time is about 8 days after the Liberation Day. So he's not there on the first day when, and we got to be clear about this. The American army in the field, they literally, for the average soldier, they didn't know they were headed for a concentration camp. They were literally stumbling into these places. And so the first day, the American troops who come into Dachau, the first unit that comes in, they're coming in a direction where there has been a train that had evacuated people from farther east into Dachau. The Nazis were pulling people from other camps into the inner camps. And there were about 2,000 people on this train who had died on the trip. And the few that had gotten off the train had been shot immediately. And the American soldiers who found this were horrified by what they found and really were angry, and it caused a real incident inside of Dachau that's still controversial. My father wasn't there that day. He's being sent in. Now, he has a camera and he's taking his own photographs. There are still, and I only use one in the book, there's a pile of bodies in the yard that still have to be dealt with. There are pictures of people, survivors in the barracks. It's not a very good photograph, but I insisted it had to be in the book because it showed people sort of in the survivors, and there's just a sense of weight. It wasn't everybody was happy instantly because they were in very bad shape, and what was going to happen next, who knew? And so why is he being sent in? Well, he's part of a truck company. They're probably carrying supplies in. That would be one, that's a simple answer. But we also have to remember that on April the 12th, the very first camp that had been liberated by the Americans, not by the Russians, by the Americans, was Ohrdruf. And after Ohrdruf had been liberated, Eisenhower ordered Bradley and Patton that the three of them were going to go into Ohrdruf and put eyes on what had happened there. And they go in, and it's horrifying. They're all three horrified by what happened. Patton literally has to go behind a building and vomit. He's seen a lot of death, but he couldn't believe what he saw there. Eisenhower, this is April the 12th, 1945, the same day that FDR died. But the time difference, of course, they're in Europe. Eisenhower then issues an order that as other camps are liberated, as many American troops as possible are to be sent in, and eyes are to be put on what had happened in these camps. Because Eisenhower says he wanted to make sure that we had eyewitness accounts of what happened, because someday in the future, people may want to deny that these things happened. And he wanted to make sure that there were people to answer that. So that's a pretty amazing thing. So a lot of people were being sent in. Maybe they didn't have an exact purpose except to witness what had happened there. The bigger part of that order was the people who lived in that village, Dachau, were to be brought into the camp, because what was happening was people were saying, we didn't know what happened inside the camp walls. The local German population was brought into the camp. They had to help clean up. They had to help bury people. They had to help, they didn't want to, but that's what was going on. So exactly why my father was there, I'm not totally clear. After his first trip in, though, he writes this incredibly powerful letter to my mother. And he says two things he says lots of things. The letter is amazing. It's in the book. I transcribed a whole letter for each chapter and this was the one. So he says, clearly the Germans are defeated, but I'm worried about children who are between 14 and 23 years old. They have grown up and know nothing except Hitlerism. And what will become of these people? I gave a presentation the other night at the Mercantile Library here in Cincinnati. And a woman that I worked with for 8 years, and I knew that her parents had been immigrants from Germany. She came to that lecture the other night, and she raised her hand and said, "Dan, my parents are from Dachau. They grew up in the village of Dachau." And she said, "What you just read from your father's letters, my parents were that generation, and they weren't nice people." And she said, this explains a lot of her relationship with her mother particularly. Anyway,
Yeah.
the other thing he says, he writes to my mother and he says, "What if you and I had grown up here? Would we have been different? I hope so, but I'm not sure." And it's exactly that sense of self-reflection, which if we're going to ask the question or make the statement, we can never allow this to happen again. You have to first have looked into yourself and said, what am I going to do if I'm faced with a situation where this may be happening again? Not just the concentration camp thing, but what allowed the concentration camps and the death camps to take place, which was 15 years in the making. So that letter is powerful. It's the pivot point of the entire book. There's a second letter where he writes about going back into Dachau another time. There may have been other times where he and Sherman Horowitz, his captain, were led around by a Polish survivor and who showed them the camp. And if you, well, talking to you, I mean, there's all kinds of survivor materials that have been written. And one of the things that survivors make the point is the most important thing were to be able to tell their story in their own words. So here was, and my father has a photograph. He's not in the photograph. He took the photograph of Sherm standing on the porch in front of the crematorium and the small gas chamber. Dachau was not a death camp, but there was a small experimental gas chamber there, but there was a crematorium for obvious reasons. And he's standing on the porch. That building's still there. I've been there. And the Polish survivor is down on the ground talking to him. And the question I'd always ask myself, including in the book, was, well, what could he really tell them? I mean, did he speak Polish? And, well, okay, Sherman spoke German. Somebody said to me the other night, maybe a German-speaking Jew and a Polish-speaking, I don't know if he was Jewish or not, maybe they could speak Yiddish together. And I had never thought of that until just the other night. That's not in the book. But that was a moment that is really important. And I've stood on that same porch, but I hadn't put it all together at that time. And 3 weeks ago, my son, his wife, and my grandson were at Dachau for their first time. And they took the book and they stood there in front of that same building and took the picture. So it's, in my mind, it's my son, Irv's grandson, closed the loop 80 years later, almost exactly 80 years later, and went back to Dachau.
Wow, that's really powerful. You know, one thing to this point that you have mentioned in other presentations, you've said if history is only about the past, it's not worth spending any time on. It's a conversation between the past and the present that's important.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's really powerful to consider the oral tradition of sharing story, but also handing down this sense of space and returning to Dachau in different contexts and with different perspective, but still rooted in that history.
This sense of conversation between the past and the present is absolutely essential to me. I'm trained as a American colonial historian. I did my graduate work at William & Mary. There's nobody living from that period, right? it's not just, I went to, I lived in Colonial Williamsburg for 3 years. It's a wonderful place. I love it. And people can get all caught up. Isn't the furniture cute? Isn't the buildings cute? That's not the point. The point is what happened there. Who were those people that allowed somebody like Thomas Jefferson to write those critical words? All men, and in parentheses, women, are equal. I mean, those are revolutionary words in Western culture.
They are.
And we're still trying to figure those out. So it's a conversation between that colonial period and the present keeps changing. Whatever happened in the past happened. We understand it differently. And some people say, well, we understand it differently because a new set of documents get discovered. Well, that occasionally happens. But more importantly, we're able to ask questions from the present about what the significance of the past human experience was in a way that we couldn't have. Now, think about, I visited Dachau almost a decade ago, not quite, about 8 years ago. I had not yet finished reading these letters. I had just started, I'd had a stroke, and I had to stop. And so I had not read my father's, all of his letters. I'd only read the first very few. And, but the questions I could have asked a decade ago are completely different than the questions I'd be asking in 2025. In 2025, what's happening in America is the dismantling of the colonial revolutionary theory of society that was created. And we're trying to take apart the type of government we created in the late 18th, early 19th century. And those questions about how can this happen again? We can't let this happen again. We should be asking those same questions. Before the day, 2 hours ago when I was at home, I heard that the president has ordered that that museums stop talking about American slavery all the time. Well, if we stop talking about who we have been in the past, we can't figure out who we are today. And we certainly can't plot a path into the future. This is a constant discussion, and we have to insist that that discussion remain whole, and it remain vibrant, and it remain challenging. So yes, that dynamic I really care about as a historian. That's how I spent my life, and I really believe that. And how do you convey that to not just students? I mean, I started out as a high school teacher, but it's adults who have experience to bring to the table. How do you communicate that to adults that, given your experience, what can you learn about the past and what do you carry into the future and how do you shape it?
Yeah. And I think that there's something really important in the values that you hold that it seems that your father and mother certainly held and handed down to you, to listen and observe and hold past and present very closely to you. I think that that's the work of upstanders, and much of the duality of the upstander and the bystander that you share in the book takes place in Dachau, right?
Oh, yeah.
With those that stood by and did nothing, and yet after the war said that they had not been part of it.
Right.
It's really interesting to be able to look back and reflect at multiple points today.
Right. I will say, though, I think it's important for people to know, especially I deal with this in the last chapter, it doesn't mean that what my father took out of his experience in the war just got translated into the way we might wish it had been translated. So, for example, when I was in college and living at home, I was a day hop at Xavier University, and that was respectable in those days. You didn't have to live on campus. I lived with my parents, and they were very conservative politically, and I started out that way. But in college, I became very involved with civil rights movement. And never once did my father say, well, in World War II, I served with an all-black company, and here's what I learned. He never told me that. He told me only that he thought the civil rights leaders were troublemakers. And my aligning myself with them, he found very problematic. So how did he translate his experience, which was very fundamental in many ways during those 3.5, almost 4 years that he was in the military? But in another way, once he's out, he kind of compartmentalized it, and he went back to his life. Whereas the men, the enlisted men in his company, who maybe, I don't know for sure because I don't have the documentation, believed in the double V promise, many of those trucking company people came back and became civil rights leaders. Medgar Evers worked in a truck company, and others in Martin Luther King's cadre were from the truck companies. So, they took a different experience out of World War II than my father took out of World War II, even though they mixed and they changed each other some way during the time. But, these are complicated human questions that it's not simple. You can't, it's not always the story I wish I could have said, oh, my father became a leader in the civil rights movement and someone who said we have to reach across the boundaries of religion to form a relationship with the Jewish community. No. When I was in college and took classes from Rabbi Goldman and visited Wise Temple for the first time, I remember coming home and telling my parents about it, and it was like, well, that's fine. They just saw the Jesuits at Xavier were radicalizing me, and they thought it might have been cute, but worrisome. And but they weren't those people. They weren't constantly pushing at the edges. They fell back into their sort of more narrow role. So, the history is complicated. Family history can be complicated.
Yeah, that's important to keep in mind. When you look back, we know that your dad didn't talk a lot about his World War II experience.
Right.
Ahead of reading some of these letters, what did you know about?
I knew nothing about serving with a all-black company. I knew nothing. Here's a very simple thing. He was a lawyer by training. Now, he never practiced law, and he always said, I never practiced law, I went into business. He was head of a savings and loan, which the only real job he had his whole life, okay? And when I was in college and decided to major in history, his way of dealing with that was, well, you can always go to law school. Pat me on the head. You can study history, but you can always go to law school, and you don't have to be a lawyer. You can. He told me that he never practiced law. I get into these letters and found out that, in fact, for a year, he was practicing law every night, not because he was a member of the Judge Advocate Corps, but because he was probably one of the few lawyers on this base in Durham, which was made up of not people who were, there just probably weren't many lawyers. So he was assigned to prosecute, they were petty cases, people AWOL, people late returning to camp, people who were mouthing off to an officer, I don't know who. But he was doing law. He told me he never practiced law. So it was just walled off. It's just really interesting how that happened. So I knew very little of this. This was opening up. And by the way, my father-in-law, who landed at Omaha, he never said anything about his experience either. And he died the year we got married. So it was a very quiet person. I think my experience as a reporter for Channel 12 was that World War II veterans tended to start really talking about their experience during the 40th and 50th anniversaries of Pearl Harbor and, whatever, because the United States had gotten to the point where it was far enough in the past and they were being told, you're the greatest generation. And so they were sort of encouraged to talk about it. But it took, and I think that's true of any war. I mean, my people who went to Vietnam who are friends, they don't want to talk about it much. So I think that's the experience of veterans, basically, and that's part of this book too. It's what's it mean to be a veteran?
How has this project changed your outlook as a historian?
Well, I've always said I'm a historian. I'm not a genealogist, and I talk to people who are in genealogy, and having worked at the Museum Center and at the old Cincinnati Historical Society, we had a lot of genealogists come in and wanted to use the records. And I always said, well, you should be doing family history. And I was in a theoretical way of saying family history means doing more than just saying so-and-so had these children and they had these children. And, I'm bored as hell about that. But what's the meaning of this? What's the significance of your family's experience? So this is the first time I've really done it. I mean, it gives me a level of respect, how you can tell through the individual experience, you can get to those bigger issues you just find out people stumbled into the right situation that allows you to sort of explore some of these things of class, of race, of international and national politics. All of that comes through in this book, but it comes up from the bottom. Now, I would have told people when I was in classrooms as an adjunct professor over the years, I would say that all the time, but I'm not sure I had fully understood it until this book, which, this could be my last one. Who knows?
Well, I don't think it should be.
I've had 3 books in the last 7 months. I'm a little exhausted at the moment.
Okay, understandable. Is there anything else that you feel is important to share about this project, about any of your other work? What are we missing?
There is one incident in this book that I think is worth sharing.
Okay.
Because I think it really brought home to my father what racism in the United States was about. In July of 1944, so this is after D-Day, they're just about to be shipped overseas to Europe, but they haven't been put on the boat yet. They're still in Durham, North Carolina, in a camp right outside Durham, North Carolina. And the camp is connected to the city of Durham by a city bus line run by the city of Durham. So on the Saturday after the 4th of July, 2 soldiers, not from his company, but from the battalion, 2 African-American soldiers in uniform, go into Durham on a Saturday. And in the afternoon, they're starting to come back, and they get on the bus, and they're the first ones on the bus. And they sit down a couple of rows behind the driver, and the driver gets into an argument with them, telling them they have to sit in the back of the bus. And one of them, Booker Spicely, who was born in Virginia but had lived part of his life in Pennsylvania, in the North, he says, why should I sit in the back of the bus? Look at the uniform I'm wearing. I can be shot just like anybody else. I'm ready to give up my life. Why should I have to? So this goes on. The next stop, a group of white soldiers get on the bus to go back to the camp. And the 2 black soldiers tell them what is happening. And they suggest, why don't we all go to the back of the bus and sit together? Sounds pretty sensible, and a way of sort of dealing with the whole thing. Halfway back, Booker Spicely decides he's going to get off the bus in a neighborhood called Haiti in Durham, which is obviously an all-black neighborhood. And as he's getting off the back door of the bus on the side, he calls out to the bus driver. He said, "I hope I didn't offend you. I didn't mean to get into an argument. I just don't see why I have to sit in the back of the bus." He gets off the bus. Bus driver pulls a gun out from under his seat, gets off the bus, walks back, shoots Spicely twice, and kills him. Sets off a race riot. My father started a letter in the morning to my mother, which was pretty, it's a sunny day, it's a nice day in July, and, we're going to go out and do something. But then he started the letter, but then it comes back and he says, "This has happened." And he said, "Before we send anybody to Europe, we should take 5 million men and wipe the South off. I never want to come back here if I ever get out. These people don't understand democracy. We should take care of this before we take care of Europe." And it's really strong. It's one of the strongest statements he ever made. But he had to come face to face with the real violence that underlay Jim Crow segregation. And unless you understand that, you come face to face with, this isn't a lynching in the sense of it being this public event where someone's hung or executed some way, but in effect it's a lynching by gun, and the community reacted. There was a race riot. A couple buildings were burnt. They were afraid the whole camp was going to get involved. It didn't, but he didn't know what happened. They got shipped out very quickly after that. I went back and found the court case. The bus driver was tried for shooting Booker Spicely and found innocent in 20 minutes.
Wow.
Because he had the right to shoot him because Spicely had sat in the wrong seat. So it's that kind of incident that just becomes a pivot point that, wow, this is there.
Yeah, and it, I think, also speaks to how remarkable these letters are, in that letter, the course of that letter changed as the day went on, as that moment happened.
And that's why I wanted to publish at least one entire letter from each chapter, because, the parts that I pulled out to make the narrative make sense, ignore, when you're writing a letter to your wife, you talk about all kinds of things. My father, being a savings and loan man, he's constantly saying, "How are we doing on paying down the mortgage?" That's in every letter practically. But, she's written and asked the question, how much coal should I buy for the winter? And should I buy it in 3 sets, or should I buy it all at once? What's the cheapest way to do it? That's kind of, you forget that these letters between a married couple talk about all kinds of issues, not just about the big public issues.
So Dan, we've worked with you for a very long time. It's our pleasure today to talk about this book, but share a little bit about your work with the center, and what it means to you to be able to share your father's story here.
Well, this goes back to the beginning of the center when it was at Hebrew Union College. And I mentioned it to my mother that I was in communication with the people who were beginning, because I was really fascinated from the very beginning of what you were doing. I love oral history. I've made oral history and oral interviewing a basic part of my whole professional life. And my mother says, "Well, your father was at Dachau and wrote this really powerful letter. Do you think they'd be interested?" That was the first time. I didn't know that letter existed. She pulled that letter out for me. I made a copy and gave it to the Holocaust Humanities Center. And I feel I've been influenced by this organization for whatever I say 25 years. I don't know when the original date was, but about that. And not only that, but as this variation, this reincarnation, and you've created this new center and this new exhibit was all being put together and really capturing this concept of this framework of upstander, bystander, perpetrator, victim, and how all of that I built that into this book because I wanted to spread the word about what this institution was doing because you've had so much influence on me. And, I've had this conversation probably 3 times in the last week with people about how they've been to Auschwitz or they've been to the U.S. Holocaust Center, and how emotionally, intellectually, spiritually overwhelming those experiences can be. The importance of this particular Holocaust Center is that partly because of the amount of space you have, you are very conscious about how you craft the story. And what sets this institution apart, in my mind, not just from other Holocaust centers, but purpose-filled historical museums, what sets you apart. And I was involved with the Freedom Center from the very beginning. I was the very first project manager. So before it was called the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, I can tell you how every one of those words were put together. I was there. What we never figured out was what you figured out, which is you deal with the history, but you don't then ask the visitor the question, what would you have done in the 1930s and 40s? Because that's an impossible question to answer. Because the only socially acceptable question is, well, I would have stood up. But my father says to my mother, would we have stood up? Would we have been any different? I hope so, but I don't know. That's the reality. You can't answer what you would have done decades ago or before you were born. You don't ask that question here. You then take people into that upstander gallery with the 24 character traits. Mm-hmm. And you expose them to that, and then you take them into that area, the last area in your museum, where you say, what's your response to contemporary issues that are out there right now, whether it's environments, whether it's civil rights, whether it's, I forget all 4 that you've got out there right now. But the point is, the question is, well, not what would you have done in the 30s and 40s? What are you going to do today to be fully human? That's the question. And this place, this institution, does that better than any other museum I have encountered in my entire career. And for that, I respect it.
Thank you. I'm so inspired coming to work every day because our work reminds me that we can all make differences in our own way and in our own world. And it's really powerful when we can all stand together and make that change real and not spend our time thinking about what we could have done then, but what we can do today is what matters the most.
I love bringing small groups of people, friends. I've done this with any number of groups of 4, 5, 6 people who are in Leadership Cincinnati. I know Leadership Cincinnati classes now come here, but as classes. But I like bringing small groups, and we'll go through. There's a book club of neighbors that are reading this book they're going to read, and they've asked me to. None of them came out at dinner the other night. None of them have ever been here, and it was, Dan, will you take us there? Because
that's great.
Museums are places that scare people. Now, I think the Museum Center in Union Terminal does better but lots of people don't think they really belong at the art museum or the great museums. It's so unfortunate. And sometimes you just need a personal guide to take you through and let it happen. You don't have to You just have to give people the opportunity, and they'll make out of it what you want. And this is the perfect place, because if you go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, after about 3 hours, I don't care who you are, you're just wiped out. You're not here.
Yeah.
You can deal with the historic story, but you can also raise the question about the present, and then you can leave and go upstairs and do something else.
Become part of our community of upstanders.
And become part of the
Hopefully.
community of upstanders. And I was so proud that 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, one of the awards was named for my father. That was a real honor.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
your
you.
story with us. Every time I sit with you, I learn more, and it influences me in many ways. So I'm really privileged to get to spend time with you today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this. And I hope my father's story really can inspire a lot of people and raise questions for them.
It does. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Thanks to Margaret and Michael Valentine for their ongoing support of this series. Managing producer is Ann Thompson, technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kik Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org.